meetings today. Friday, November 8th meeting of the FORA Reuse Authority. Let's see. So we'll do the, I'm calling it to order, Pledge of Allegiance. Should we do that now? I think that's a good idea. Councilmember Reimers, would you lead us in the pledge? Thank you. And our first order of business is closed session. So, Council, will you speak to us of that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Members of the board and public, we're going to go to closed session on two items today. The first is public employment, Government Code Section 54957B1, Personnel Executive Officer Position. And the second item, 3B, conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, initiation of litigation pursuant to paragraph 4 of subdivision D of California Government Code Section 54956.9, one potential case.
Thank you. Is there any member of the public who'd like to comment on any of the items that we'll be discussing in closed session? All right, seeing no one coming forward, we will recess to closed session.
20th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at Soper Field as well.
Thank you, sir. Any questions for our executive officer on these announcements? All right. Seeing none, we'll move to roll call. Take it away, Madam Clerk.
Supervisor Parker.
Here.
Supervisor Phillips. Here. Supervisor Adams. Here. Councilmember Gagliotti. Here. Councilmember O'Connell. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Morton. Here. Councilmember Hoffa. Here. Mayor Oglesby. Here. Councilmember Wizard. Here. Mayor Carbone.
Here.
Mayor Gunter.
Here.
Councilmember Garfield.
Here.
Councilmember Reimers.
Here.
Kathleen Lee. Nicole Hollingsworth. Erica Parker. Debbie Hale. Dr. Diffenbaugh. Steve Monterazzo. Dr. Ochoa. Colonel Ford. Bill Collins. David Martin. Lisa Reinheiner. And Dr. Matt Zefferman. We have a quorum.
Thank you. We'll move now to the consent agenda. Is there any board member who would like to pull any item for comment or question?
So
Yes,
I would just like
Dr.
to
Morton.
take a separate vote in the minutes for August 16th. I know
Okay.
it's our third stab. I just want to vote no.
Okay.
So,
Sounds good. The
I'm sorry.
August 15th. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh my gosh,
Any member of the public wanting to pull any items from consent? All right, so with that said, we will return to the consent agenda, and if someone would make a motion to approve
Second.
B through G.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. And then we'll go back to 7A, which is the minutes for August 15th, 2019. I'd entertain a motion to approve those minutes. We've got a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
opposed.
Thank you. We have one no vote on that. Thank you. We'll move now to business items. I will just note that item 8B is being removed from the agenda for today. And so we will take up 8A.
Thank you, Chair. Mira Park and I will do a little tag team on this particular item. If the board members recall, last month there was a couple of motions with respect to this item, and the friendly the substitute motion actually did not succeed. It failed, and so there's a second vote, which is essentially that the board would ask for additional information to come back on item 2 of the 2 items under this consideration. So if it pleases the board, that in essence means if you vote today in favor of that, it would mean we'd bring it back in December. So staff, thinking ahead, decided to suggest that the board consider taking action on items 1 and 2, and staff, instead of waiting till next month to bring it back, has added items related to the questions posed about item 2. So in this presentation, we'll cover both. It was after reviewing the tape, we did not hear any objections to the item number 1, supporting that item as was recommended by Authority Council, that we execute liability release terms for retiring staff. So Mira Park is going to focus her comments about item 2, which is approve option A or B to clarify post-FORA employment health benefits for terminated employees. Mira?
Okay, great. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Parker, and members of the board and public. I'm back with more options. So thank you again for giving us this opportunity to explore further the 2 post-health employment reimbursement options. So as Michael mentioned, at the last board meeting, the board expressed interest in looking at a health reimbursement arrangement and cash out options for employees once they are laid off so they can continue on with their health care coverage. So we looked at the pros and cons of these 2 options, and we also received input from the affected employees. Let's see here. Oopsie. How do I advance to the next slide? So option A and option 2 are up for your consideration. Both options require no administrative overhead. So once FORA sunsets at the end of June 2020, there will be no burden on the agency that will be taking over any remaining administrative functions. The health reimbursement account, the HRA, does require a one-time setup fee and a prepayment of the maintenance fee, but the fee is slightly offsetted by employer tax savings, so the employer doesn't have to contribute to the Medicare tax. The funds are available to the employees tax-free, so they can use all of the funds to pay for eligible healthcare expenses such as premium costs, out-of-pocket, deductibles, copay, dental, vision, etc. Option B is a straight cash-out option. So when an employee is laid off, they receive the cash and they can do what they want with the cash, and they use it how they see fit. It doesn't have to be specifically for healthcare expenses. One of the disadvantages, or the major disadvantage of the health cash-out option, is that those funds will be taxed at the tax rate of that employee. So from my conversations with the affected employees, continued health care coverage is still a very important thing for everyone. So most would prefer option A because it provides the greatest dollar amount to allow them to use for health care expenses. So I can take any questions at this time.
Thank you. Any questions from board members? All right, yes, Ms. Garfield.
Thank you. I was one of the people who said we should at least consider this. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to hear from the employees that the first one is seen by them as being more beneficial. And that was what I wanted. So I appreciate the time that we were allowed to investigate this further, and I would be ready to vote on it.
Thank you. Any questions from board members? Any member of the public wanting to comment on this item? All right, I'll bring it back to this board for action.
So I would move that we have to have both again. Authorize the executive officer to execute liability release terms for retiring staff upon authority, council recommendation, and approval to include recent retirees, and approve option A, that's HRA up there, to clarify the post-FORA employment health benefits for terminated employees is administered.
Thank you. There's a motion. There's a second. Any further discussion by the board? We had the healthy one last time. Yes, Mr. Hulamar.
Just want to make a minor correction. The word "how" is missing between clarify and post.
That's probably why it's not.
Yeah, not your fault.
Looking for that is part of my motion, the word how.
How? All right. Okay. All right. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. We'll move now to item 8C, Habitat Conservation Plan Status Report and Joint Powers Authority Formation.
Chair, members of the board, we're going to have a brief presentation that we're going to provide. This, I promise, will last no more than 15 minutes total. My part of it will only be 6 or 7 minutes. The board members are fully aware, based on the announcements that have been made and the fact that we have provided written, email, newspaper, Twitter, Facebook, and other notifications that the Habitat Conservation Plan has now been published by the United States government. The Department of the Interior published this November 1st. So we're going to do a little presentation that gives you a little outline of the Habitat Conservation Plan. We know that many of you have seen pieces of this before, but not everyone in the community was involved as far back as 1991 when this started. Go ahead. Great. This timeline kind of gives you just a small sampling of the number of actions that this board has taken and others in the region have taken to support habitat conservation. I think most of you know this first slide is pretty consistent. Back in '91, the announcement was made about Fort Ord closure, and in '93 there was a great deal of work being done to understand the full environmental impacts of the disposal of the property by the Army to the local community. And in 1993, there was a significant biological opinion that was issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which governed a lot of how the habitat conservation planning process started. The habitat management program, I think Bill Collins started working on this specific issue when he first started with the United States Army in the 1990s. The published habitat management plan covered 18 special status species and was under process for quite a while. There was a record of decision that was completed on the disposal of property at Fort Ord. The HMP supported that record of decision. In 1996, the Department of the Interior published a series of rules that removed some of the listing of species in categories 1 and 2 and reworked all of the habitat process so that the habitat management plan was then revised. There was a published one earlier, and then there was a revised one in 1996. Many of you in the room are signatories to that habitat management plan, Peter. Then in the following years, 1997 through 2005, there was a significant amount of work done on various components of the habitat management planning process, which included the original crafting of a joint HCP HMP, but it was in fact in 1997 those two documents were actually split and bifurcated. The United States Army chose to move that way so that the HMP could be adopted in time to support other actions that they were taking on the base, including support of the munitions removal process. That meant that the HCP had to stand alone and had to be recreated in that image. So from 1999 through 2005, there were several additional forms that took. There were also changes at the federal government level that included new species while that was working. It included changing how HCPs would be funded and approved. The original habitat conservation plan, the estimate for cost to complete over the 50-year time frame was just under $9 million. That number has been more than quintupled to date. The next slide, please. So in 2005 was kind of a significant point where several of the entities on Fort Ord began their development process. The Marina Heights project, the Delray Oaks project, the East Garrison project. In every case, in order for those projects to move ahead, they had to negotiate through biological opinions and get their own permits to move ahead. In the meantime, habitat was not really being managed or operated or functionally operated in a holistic way. It was in a very segmented way. Fortunately, we had leadership of now Mayor Bruce Delgado, but at the time, Bureau of Land Management staff member Bruce Delgado. We had a number of folks back in those days, in the early days, with Steve Addington. Ken Gray from the city of Marina was a leader in all of these things. But in 2005, things started really picking up, where every time a project moved ahead, it had to address the individual species in a fragmented or segmented way rather than a holistic way. And as a consequence of that, there was a series of questions that surfaced. In fact, the State of California Department of Fish and Game at the time, now Fish and Wildlife, changed their approach and asked the Fort Ord Reuse Authority to find a new habitat consultant. And the FORA board chose to follow that lead, brought in some folks from now Jones and ICF, but at the time Jones and Stokes, to complete that work. They did finish a draft habitat conservation plan, which was submitted in 2009 for review. The comments on this took over 2.5 years to complete. I think it says 2012, where the last reviews were supposed to occur. And then moving into 2014, Peter, we had additional work that Forest staff did. The most important part of this was in 2016, right in the middle of that slide. It points out that U.S. Fish and Wildlife provided 9 general habitat conservation change recommendations. That resulted in what was a major rewrite of the Habitat Conservation Plan, and what was important at that date is our former congressman just went through the roof when the first parts of this started leaking out in 2015, that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was going to require that all of the national monument be exempted from Fort Ord Reuse Authority's base-wide habitat conservation plan, when in fact what the FORA board's policy has been from day one is to holistically look at how the resources at the former Fort Ord would be conserved. It was the basis of everything we've done in habitat conservation planning on the former Fort Ord. This would have put us into different ball games. It would have said the work being done to help in the restoration, the work being done that BLM does extraordinary work, would not be part of the overall and collective management process, and would be, in a sense, at least legally and probably programmatically, be completely separate. And as a consequence of the firestorm that came as a result of that, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agreed to make some adjustments. And so therefore we did do, in 2016 and 17, a new habitat conservation plan addressing some of the concerns Fish and Wildlife put together, and came back with a screen check draft that we sent to all the permittees in 2017. That was the good news. It still took from 2017 till almost the middle of this year to get all of the comments back and to make sure that we had all of our consultants in place. Peter, if we can go to the next one, so that we have everything submitted, have that reviewed. Denise Duffy and Associates has been the predominant writer of all the environmental documents. That's both an environmental impact report and an environmental impact statement, since this is both a federal and a state process, so that we are in compliance with both as we move forward and that they are in sync with one another. And so there's some schedule issues that will be coming up in a few minutes that Aaron Harwain will talk about. But if all works well, next spring, in March or so, this FORA board will be requested to take action on the HCP and the EIS-EIR. In fact, it's really the EIR. If I can go to the next slide, just a couple of quick notes about why an HCP. I mentioned a little bit of this before, but the real focus here is to have local administration, local oversight, local responsiveness to how the habitat management plan is implemented. Again, the habitat conservation plan is an implementation tool of the habitat management plan. Everyone that gets property on Fort Ord, in their deed it will say you must comply. The habitat conservation plan gives us not necessarily a universal, but a comprehensive collective way of meeting those obligations, which I would contend is much more efficient, probably much more effective, probably much more engaged, but certainly the best for doing what I consider to be a holistic, base-wide resource conservation program. And that, whether it's Sangelia or Monterey spineflower or Yaden's piperia or any of the listed species or the programs, the idea is to have a healthy environment for the species to thrive, to replicate, and etc. So another reason is to have a cooperative resource management. The educational economic reuse, this is an asset to all of that. You can go to Atlanta and look at their trails program and their habitat conservation program that circumnavigates parts of the city. It's a great asset to the economic recovery that they're facing at Fort McPherson and other places where their reuse is done. Similarly, you find that in Colorado, at Stapleton or in Lowry Air Force Base. Those reuse programs have similar kinds of programs where they have gone to these asset management of natural resources as an asset to the recovery program. So this means cooperatively and coordinated the implementing the base reuse plan's message of environmental conservation as part of our 3 E's. So I'd like to turn this over to Aaron to talk about schedule and other items. There is a potential for a board workshop on this issue. but we're going to try to give you a little bit of an elevated presentation today in 15 or 20 minutes to give you a heads up on where we're going with this. Aaron?
Thank you, Michael. And I think Michael touched on most of these, but I'm happy to answer any questions after this is over. So thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, Chair and members of the board and public. We're very happy to be here with this announcement today. I'm Erin Harwain with Denise Duffing Associates. We are the CEQA NEPA lead, the federal and state environmental compliance lead for the HCP process. We've been under contract and working on this for 15 years. And that claim to fame has its pros and cons. I was gently reminded before this meeting that I didn't have my second son at the time that we started this contract, who's now 13. But at least he's not calling me a boomer yet. He's calling my husband a boomer, which is entertaining. You know, there are reasons for why it took so long are numerous, but I think we should take this moment to celebrate and applaud the effort. There are so many of the members of the board and public and your staff that have worked really hard on this over the years, so be sure to thank your staff that have been so involved. There's been multiple rounds of review. We completed 5 versions of the EIS-EIR before it went public, so 6 total. Lots of review time, lots of comments, lots of meetings, so thanks everyone. It takes a village for sure. So I wanted to go over the schedule moving forward. As Michael mentioned, we initiated the public review period last Friday on November 1st. We published the notice of availability at the California State Clearinghouse Office of Planning and Research, so OPR. We posted the notice of availability also at the Monterey County Clerk, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service posted their NOA notice of availability on the Federal Register the same day. So everyone's got a coordinated 45-day public review period moving forward. Most importantly, I want to highlight there's it's not required, it's a voluntary meeting that we're holding, public meeting to solicit public comments on the HCP and the EIS-EIR during the public review period. That's on November 20th from 6 to 8 p.m. and that it will be in the city of Seaside at the community center at Soper Field. We'll be sending out directions, or if you have any questions, again, please let us know. That notice of availability is also provided hard copy outside on the table if anyone's interested. If it's, of course, on the FORA website, it's on the Federal Register website and the OPR's website. All those documents, all the documents and appendices are available there as well. Let's see, so we published also the notice. We've done a lot of outreach already in the last week. Monterey County Weekly published our notice starting yesterday. The Herald, it was in the Herald today, and it'll be in the Californian tomorrow. So we're doing a significant amount of public outreach. FORA has also sent out an email blast, which many of you were probably CC'd, and that went to over 85, 90 people. Oh, and hard copies for those that cannot access anything electronically. There is a hard copy available in FORA's office and also at the Seaside branch of the library. I think I got that all covered. So moving forward, as comment letters come in, we will be coordinating our response to comments effort so that we can finalize the EIS, EIR, and HCP in January of 2020. It's a very tight turnaround as the public review period closes on December 16th. And I'll get to public comments and how to do that in the next slide. So during this time, again, we'll be performing a significant amount of public outreach and community outreach and being available to answer questions. We anticipate a FORA board action on the HCP and EIS-EIR in March of 2020 and subsequent permittee actions in May of 2020, and that's specifically under CEQA as responsible agencies. The permittees will be required to make findings under CEQA and also adopt the plan and ordinances. So that'll be brought up at the all permittee meeting as well, so we'll be talking about that. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife is coordinating the comments. They are in charge of compiling all the comment letters. So we're encouraging all written comments to be submitted in one of 3 ways, or you can submit them all 3 ways if you like, by mail to the Ventura office in Ventura, in Fish and Wildlife Service in Ventura. You can send them by email, and you can also fax for those that still do that. Again, everything needs to be, all written comments need to be received by 5 p.m. on December 16th. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kendall.
Thank you so much. Again, I'm Kendall Flint with Regional Government Services, and the tag team tonight is me basically explaining the next steps as it relates to the Joint Powers Authority. And I'm just waiting for a moment for my slide to arrive. Okay, one of the things that comes about with the implementation of the Habitat Conservation Plan is the possibility of developing a cooperative agreement or a joint powers authority among the 12 agencies or permittees that have property within the former Fort Ord. We've been meeting with folks along the way and talking with individuals, but we've also been taking a look at the request of members of the admin committee and some of the board members as to how this JPA might function, how it might be funded, and what type of organizational tools might be used to make it the most efficient. So as part of our research, we've been looking through other HCP's habitat conservation plans established in the state of California for this purpose. And we looked at over 20 of them throughout the state and then really narrowed it down to 4 that were most similar to what would be happening here at the Fort Ord Reuse Authority. So when we look at these 4 particular agencies, these all have HCPs that are implemented now, and these are all being performed by Joint Powers Authority, and in each case they're made up of a collective of cities, their county, and in some cases special districts, educational facilities, and other entities that provide the support. In all the cases that we looked at, they had multiple species, multiple acres, multiple challenges in terms of their implementation. Now, San Joaquin is probably one of the older ones. They are closing up over the next couple of years here, but when we look at those, they were predominantly staffed through individuals at the San Joaquin regional government and basically used contractors in order to implement the various things that were happening there. When we look at East Contra Costa County, again, also a Joint Powers Authority, 4 cities as well as the county. They are also a collaborative of some limited staff, utilization of contractors, and then individual entities provided staff to support their efforts. All of these different things we're going to go over in greater depth at the November 20th meeting, but I just was trying to show that when you look at the way that they're spending their money and the way that the funds were invested in terms of startup, the average cost of the administration, which would be finance, grants, executive officer, this sort of thing, was anywhere between $250,000 and roughly $400,000 to $500,000. And then the implementation of the plan itself really varies based on the complexity of the species that they are mitigating and also the amount of land that they have. YOLO is another one that is very similar to this particular HCP should it be formed. And again, this is a combination of staff and contractor. So when we looked at all of these different pieces, we also looked at the ways that they funded their startup and then they funded what happened in the future. Each was a little bit different. When we look here at this particular one, this is YOLO, they have a combination of fees that they calculated out. I think most of you have heard the phrase, thank you, Cfd Replacement Fee. There really isn't a community facilities district replacement fee out there, right? So we have to come up with another funding mechanism to take the place of the money that FORA previously contributed to this effort. So this can be done by a variety of different ways, including a set fee package, a combination of impact fees, and contributions by the local permittees. So when we look at all these different pieces, there are different ways of doing this and different approaches. And when we meet on the 20th, we'll be going through some of these options with the permittees so that you'll be able to ask questions and then also be able to hear from the agencies who have done this in the past to kind of see how they did it, what the implementation costs were, and how successful they were. In this particular one, YOLO, another option, they did a per acre fee. Others looked at a per acre plus the size of the development itself, the number of units, the type of land that was being utilized. There were different other combinations there. And in this particular case, one got a little bit, actually quite complicated, where it looked at all the different possible impacts the particular development might have. What we're really looking for is a fee structure or a mechanism to replace the funds that were previously generated by FORA that can then be used to implement the habitat conservation plan moving forward. So in terms of the Jpa timeline, in your packages today, you're going to see a draft Jpa agreement. It is for your information only. Each of the individual permittees will have an opportunity to weigh in on that, and then that will be a discussion among the individual agencies. But I did want you all to know that that's based on very specific comments and requests for clarifications that were received from all of the permittees out there, and that includes, of course, the county, the state, various schools, and all the member agencies. What we're hoping for at this point is that now that FORA Council has looked at it and some of the other folks have looked at it, that you will take this back to your various legal representatives and have them weigh in. We're going to have the permittee meeting on the 20th, an opportunity to answer questions and ask questions. I strongly hope you will give us the questions you have prior to the meeting. So in some cases, I know Member Morton has already provided us with some things she wants to have answered. If there's anything that you want answered, please email FORA staff or me directly so that we can have those answers, if at all possible, for you at that meeting. The point of that is that after that, we would expect to see presentations in front of each of the permittees agencies where we can answer additional questions, and then if they decide to move forward, take action on adopting the JPA resolutions to form the JPA in the January-February timeframe. Now, if that happens, one of the things that we do notice, and we did hear some comments back, in the current agreement as listed, there are a number of things that are not spelled out. That is an intentional choice, and that was there because a number of the agencies expressed a desire for the JPA itself to determine what type of a process would be used to determine member contributions, how it would be funded, what types of fees would be explored, what the structure would look like, would there be a brick and mortar building or would it exist virtually, all these different things. So the idea here is that in the first couple months, March and then through April, May, and June, the permittees as that JPA would convene and then make those decisions collaboratively with their other members. I want to be very clear that if the JPA does move forward, FORA does not have a seat on the JPA board, does not have staff contributing to that. This is a separate thing just for the permittees for the exclusive purpose of the implementation of the Habitat Conservation Plan. So that is why it's separate. Now, a lot of people have asked, great, if I sign this agreement and let's say everything's going well for the first year or two, what if I want a divorce? What if I want to leave? That's one of the things that the collaborative would have to work out in terms of what does that mean. If one member leaves, does it dismantle the entire organization? Those are all things that would be worked out. And then as the collective works on those issues be memorialized and then amended into the existing JPA agreement to reflect whatever it is that the cooperative wants to see moving forward. That also includes, again, the contributions of members and the types of things that you would expect to see going forward. We've also included some links. I'm sure that many of you have seen joint powers authorities before. RGS is actually a JPA itself, but in case you haven't, we did want to put a link in there to the League of Cities, has a really good legal paper about the form, function, and requirements for forming a joint powers authority in the state of California. We've also included some links for the other HCPs out there that have been implemented through JPAs that are specific to environmental compliance. We will be going over everything from the construction, the cost, to the actual implementation options at that meeting on the 20th. So we do encourage you all to attend. I believe that council has released a draft meeting notice for those of you that would like to notice it so that you can have multiple council members and or board members attend. We will not be making any decisions at that meeting, but rather we expect to have a robust public discussion with the folks that are attending, and we hope as many of you can and will attend and make it a worthwhile event. And that concludes that particular part of the presentation, but I am available for questions if you have any.
Yes, Chair and members of the board, this presentation was to give you an overview level of what you'll need to hear in part at some later date. This part clearly establishes for you the distinction and it's the different grain silos that these things are working in. One of the grain silos is what happens with the permittees. That's not everyone at this table. The permittees are really the ones long-term that have the obligations and responsibilities under the HCP, will form a joint powers authority, assuming that does happen, to actually take that on. That's the permittees meeting. I thought Kendall did a great job of distinguishing how that function is over here. Another function is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Habitat Conservation Plan under federal law and the accompanying environmental impact statement, and what has to happen for that to occur is on a separate track, which is running on the same track as the Habitat Conservation Plan and for state fish and wildlife to make a determination under state law for protection of species. Those things are happening. And then a completely separate track, the FORA board may decide later how it assists and how it might provide some funding if there's any residual community facilities district funds. So those are the separate tracks. So that's what we wanted to offer to you today about what is before the Monterey Bay region with respect to this 17,000 plus acres of habitat and wonderful resources that are being protected in this process.
Thank you. Questions by board members for any of the presenters? Director Hoffa and then Director Matarazzo.
Michael, you mentioned how the amount of money we're expected to dedicate to this has changed over time. Do we have a final determination now? Do we know exactly what the final bill is?
Because we have provisions in these documents that allow a stay-ahead provision, which we are ahead right now, we know we have $15.8 million, Helen? About $16 million we have set aside of the revenues that we've accumulated that can be made available for this purpose. When I said that the board may make a decision later, there also are funds we're collecting now and will have sometime next May or June and probably have a better handle on at the mid-year budget in February about how those funds might be used. We know that if you do this in the way that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has suggested, we're talking in excess of $40 million that we would need in addition to what we have to make this work. However, part of the process that Kendall has outlined includes the permittees looking at what the structure is going to be, how that might operate and be funded, what are some of the cost savings. But I think to get the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to issue a 1085 permit, which is an outgrowth of the process, it'll require keeping finances into the endowment fund ahead of the use of habitat for development purposes like trails, which is one of the things that's cleared by an HCP.
Okay.
Thank you. Director Matarazzo?
To my knowledge, this could create a very unique situation under CEQA law. And someone like Kendall might have the answer to it, but I don't, and I've followed CEQA law for many years. You know, as you know, environmental documents are sued all the time. So if the document is sued and the lead agency isn't there to take care of the issue, you know, courts either say, yeah, the document's okay, or here's some problems, fix it. So who's going to fix it? The lead agency has gone away. So the number one question is, maybe there's case law on it, but I doubt it. And, so can the JPA take the role of lead agency should that occur, or should the HCP not be adopted for some reason by the time FORA sunsets?
I think I saw Authority Council taking quite a few notes, and I'm sure that I'm sure before the board is asked to take an action in that regard, he'll have to answer that question.
Good.
I think that's a perfect, one of the things that is good for us to have for the 20th, but I did want to point out, and this is really important because it came up, I believe it was City of Marina that said this, It's one of the reasons you want a joint powers authority as opposed to a memorandum of understanding, because the JPA offers the shield of litigation, right? So none of the member agencies can be held personally liable for what's happening with the JPA. And my understanding, but I will defer to John, is that that's one of the reasons that our friends at LAFCO are asking for additional funding for litigation, because the JPA would be simply a joint powers authority to implement, but they would not be the lead agency on the...
That's correct.
Yeah.
Great. Director Morton and then Director Wizard.
So I just wanted to follow up on the litigation questions for John to research. So, but first, Kendall, I do understand that every agency that's going to be a permittee is listed as a permittee, but the way this draft document, which I understand we're all going to be working with, is the idea is even though you're identified as a permittee, your entity, jurisdiction or entity would not be liable. That's the structure that you have put forward here.
Correct. The JPA has its own shield, like a corporation, right? And so that anything that is, the JPA itself with its funding could be sued, right?
Right.
But it would, that liability would not go to the member agencies. Okay. They would be shielded from that.
Right. So they can't pierce the corporate veil.
Correct.
Is what you're trying to explain to me. But what, yeah, hopefully. But what is the statute of limitations to this question about Steve's question about the EIR being sued upon? What are we looking at as an exposure time period that the underlying document litigation could happen? Even if we adopt it, even if this FORA board, what's the timeline? You don't need to answer that today, but I'm sure that's a question that other people want answered. And then the other thing is that in this joint exercise of powers agreement, if in fact the daunting task of $40 million that we are going down the path that I get there's a keep ahead provision and now we're no longer keeping ahead, that we've fallen back, what happens?
Great question, and actually that's one of the things we're going to illustrate graphically on the 20th. So just so we're clear, $40 million is the target at full build out for what is perceived, right? However, it is still a scalable situation. In other words, it's not $40 million at day one. It's $40 million over the period of time that it would take or to implement. So what you're looking at is constructing a fee, either a fee or a revenue stream that is acceptable to all of the permittees that will meet that need. However, when we looked at the projections through EPS, the time frame from when that might happen really stretched out because we reduced the number of units being built to a more reasonable 300 as opposed to I think it was 1,200 to begin with, which puts it out further. And then the other thing, which is actually quite good news that we're going to look at, again, strictly in scenarios, but should the endowment remain the same and we do see, let's say, $2 million and the board chooses to put something else in there, we're at a starting point that actually looks out at anywhere between 4 and 6 years of implementation if nothing else happened, which would be the stay ahead, which does give, I think, the JPA adequate time to solve some of those issues. And I don't think they need to wait 5 years, but definitely it's not something you have to solve in the first 3 minutes. Okay. You've got time in order to adjust. And I would also like to reiterate, again, that the documents in the transition plan that was adopted in 2018 basically say that if the JPA or some form isn't formed by April 1st of 2020, it reverts over to the habitat management plan. And there's some real advantages, as Michael mentioned, to the HCP from a long-term implementation standpoint. But I think more than that, just to reiterate, the JPA has time to find its path. It has time to come to agreement and consensus among its members in a completely different venue than this. And I think that once you have an opportunity to do that, you've got some opportunities to actually look further down the road with a fresh eye, if you would.
And just a follow-up question on that, if you're going down the path, we have the HCP, it's approved here, the permittees come to an agreement, you're going down the path, and then at some point you find out it's not financially feasible, or I do see you have withdrawal provisions in here. Would the withdrawal provisions have a substitute structure? Would we be considering this as permittees for the HMP, which we are obligated to do?
Right, so what would happen, it's a great question. So in the formation of the Joint Powers Authority, let's say that let's say it's perfectly feasible, but let's just say that Marina or Seaside or somebody else didn't want to play anymore, right? The permittees would have to establish a criteria and a methodology to disperse the funds that were held by the JPA in some manner that is equitable and agreeable to them. And so you would have to figure that out, and then that would have to become memorialized in the Joint Powers Authority agreement in order for that to move forward. So you wouldn't, I think, I've heard it before, it's like when people get into business together, everybody's happy at the beginning, but when things start going sideways is when you got to worry. So in the agreement, you want to think ahead on that possibility and see if you've got something that you need to put in there to make sure that it's going to work smoothly. But yes, those funds would then be distributed as the permittees see fit in their cooperative effort. Director Wizard?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the palatable and as brief as possible presentation. I know it's very difficult stuff. If you had to guess, when do you think the first time the JPA would have to come online? Would I have to approve something or agree to something?
So if I was Queen of the Forest, we would all adopt our agreements in January and February, and each agency would appoint one individual to sit on the board, except for Seaside, Marina, and the county, which get 2. And that first meeting, which would happen hopefully in like March of 2020, then you start talking about things like the criteria for funding. What scenario do you want to use? EPS has already come up with 3 or 4 different ones. There are others out there. But you basically, I think, have between, say, March and even through the summer, 6 months to outline all of those things and get them going. There are some things that will be more complicated than others. Certainly the percentages of the way that funds go out and the percentages that are required by each agency. And there's different ways of looking at that. It can be based on potable water, it can be on acreage, it can be on all kinds of things. And there are repercussions or financial repercussions for each of those things. We will be bringing those up in broad strokes at that meeting in November. We'll be bringing those up in very specific strokes at presentations that will be done before each of your councils beginning in December. And I believe we're actually seeing you, I think, on the 5th is what Craig told me. So we will have opportunities to go through that information with you at that time.
Through the chair. Thank you. So I guess there's a disconnect between how I understand this and the presentation. So the endowment creates the compounding interest that sustains it long term. But are we paying the federal government or the state government through that interest?
No.
So at some point, the endowment will reduce to a point where we're in deficit spending, and then it will go away.
Yes. So that's the whole point. If you'd never put any more money into it, that was what I was saying. If you did nothing, you probably are looking at a 5 to 7 year time before the money runs out, right? So that's why they're looking down the road, saying if you're going to continue to stay ahead and you're going to be able to implement this in the long term. And keep in mind, when we're talking long term, we're talking decades, a long term. It's not a short window of time. So that $40 million is projected to be as we're required if you go to the full build out of what's imagined at this point in the base reuse plan. That being said, the endowment, it would be great if it was $100 million and then that was generating interest, and like that happens. You normally think of an endowment that way. I would think of this as a great starting point. It's a great nest egg, a great place for the permittees to be able to have a little bit of cushion in order to develop their own plans moving forward, but it's certainly not going to be enough money to sustain the JPA or the HCP implementation in the long term. But it is, on today's math, it's probably about 30–35% of it.
Just very briefly, Madam Chair. So just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, if we had all $40 million today, the interest generated from that would be enough for us to get to the end of whatever EPS is whatever we have told EPS the projection is for the build out.
Yes.
As we go over time, with a sufficient amount of stay ahead built in, while we don't have a lot of interest coming in because we have a smaller initial investment in the endowment, over time that's going to sustain us enough as long as we keep replenishing the pot as we continue to pull those take permits.
Correct. So let's say it's a $20 million endowment right now, for lack of a better number. You're theoretically earning some on that and then spending some on that. But if you're also generating permits that require fees, you're putting that money in. And if you can get the right balance, right, where you've got money coming in and less going out, then you're sustaining that endowment for a longer period of time. But I think it's really important to keep in mind on that this is all driven by economic engines and by future development. And these are, Michael's talking about the different trains. There's all kinds of trains going out of this building these days. But, you know, as an example, the building removal or economic downturn, all of those things ultimately affect the number of permits that will be pulled. So you can see that if you have buildings are gone, the possibility of more development happening means things move a little faster. If that doesn't happen, then things might move slower. So these are all kind of connected in an interesting and FORA-like way. I know that's the only way I could really put it. With
Thank you. Any other board members with questions at this point? I guess, yes, Director.
No, I just want to make the point of the FORA-like way, which is the economic engine. And as we talk about slowing down and going our separate ways, we need to make sure we're encouraging the economic development on these lands. Because, let's be clear, Seaside will not be left holding the bag if we're not allowed to use our lands for economic development. Okay.
Thank you. I have a question, and you've probably said this, but it's not like going click in my brain. And that is the meeting on November 20th with the permittees. Are they going to be looking at the EPS financial analysis and the scenarios and sort of doing a quick look at whether they think this thing is feasible enough to participate in?
Yeah, I want to be clear though, they're not going to be taking any action on the 20th, but what we are going to do is show some very high level information about the different scenarios, and we'll also have printed material available. Much of this material, by the way, was also going through the admin committee, but again, members of the public and other folks want to see it too. So when we look at here's some different scenarios about how it might go, we will show that graphically, and we're also working on some things that says, okay, at this growth level it looks like this, at this growth level it looks like that, so you can kind of see it. I think the other thing that we got, at least from a number of the permittees, is look, we want to know at the startup, at day one, little questions. Can we use the endowment to hire our own attorney, to hire our own stuff? Do we need to find a brand for us? I mean, what can we do with that? And what are the projected costs of that startup? And how long will it take for those things to do? And how long will it take for the implementation of the JPA? So all of those will be looked at a very big level. But I do encourage you, again, if you have any specific questions, anything you absolutely need to know, definitely send it to us in advance of that meeting. But also know that for each and every permittee, I'm going to be going to those meetings to address questions that are specific to those agencies, because I know there's quite a few, and we've met with county council and about 10 of your folks, so their list was long.
So the EPS information, is that available on the FORA website?
It is. It's part of the admin packages from the last 2 meetings, and I believe that for the admin committee meeting next week, there's an expanded narrated, not a narration, but an expanded version of that would be made available as a handout that explains the second set of projections that were prepared.
Okay. I mean, it'd be very handy that if people could just find it by going on the FORA website. Is part of the analysis looking at the kind of the cost structure and projections if we go with an HCP as opposed to the fallback HMP?
Yeah, and I think actually FORA staff has been really forthcoming with that information over the last several years and talking about what those 2 scenarios look like. And so we will be touching on that on the 20th, just saying that, you know, here's the differences in an overall cost projection. But I think it's, you know, it's important to note that in the long term, the HMP is a more expensive proposition overall than the HCP, and the HCP is more likely because of the permitting process to make it easier for the economic development engine to drive, because it allows for permit for takes to happen. Otherwise, each agency has to get their permit individually, and that can be a little more problematic. I think the other thing we'll be talking about on the 20th, which did come up, Fish and Wildlife has some very specific ideas about what they will or will not allow in terms of a implementation plan. The use of volunteers, not going to happen. There are things that you have to do in order to make this work and get your permit. On the flip side, we've been able to identify a number of cost savings that I think we'll be able to discuss in more detail based on what we've seen from other agencies in the state of California who've already implemented.
I just know that the county has a lot of habitat lands, and so, I mean, I know that the county is going to be looking at what are going to be the costs for us to manage this properly, and is the money going to be available? So, good. So they've probably already asked you a bunch of those questions. So, Director Morton?
Just to follow up on to your point, at the admin committee there was a discussion about public noticing because Brown Acts. I want to remind everybody of that. But secondly, I want to be sure that all the documents that we are going to be asked to look at, consider, discussed on the 20th can be included in each jurisdiction's noticing of the meeting without us having to go to a FORA and try to find the pieces. And maybe, I know you talk with all of our city managers, et cetera.
I think that's a good suggestion. What we can do, and I think the simplest way to keep it clean, we can send out a master link of all the documents we were referencing to each of the city managers, and then they can link back to the FORA site for those things. But I want to make sure everyone, it's not a FORA meeting. I mean, we're encouraging the noticing, and I believe FORA Council actually put together a draft on that, because I agree with you. It's just safer than sorry, right? But we'll get as much of that information out as possible. And much like some of the background documents with the JPA and everything else, I think that's important for people to read, because not everybody does this every day.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the public unless there are any other questions that are on people's mind right away. All right, public comment on this item? Yes.
I'm Eric Morgan. I'm the manager of the Fort Ord National Monument, and I want to congratulate FORA and Fish and Wildlife Service and others, Aaron, Denise Duffy Associates, a lot of people that are around this table for working on this thing for so long. I think I've been at meetings with Aaron for 20 years, on this thing, so it's remarkable. There's been a lot of bumps along the road. 2005, like Michael said, state added a bump. I think their bump may have been related to some judicial rulings. Fish and Wildlife Service's bump in 2016 was a result of a judicial ruling, so don't necessarily cast blame on the agencies, but they're responding to judicial rulings. When something goes as long as it does, there's case law that sometimes inflects or changes the course of a planning effort. So I do want you to know, though, that as far as the HCP goes, we really hope that this board will take this over the finish line. It's so close. It doesn't change any of the land use allocations that are already in the habitat management plan, so nothing has changed. What's potentially available for development under the HMP and the reuse plan is the same under the HCP. But you should be aware there's a lot of open space at Fort Ord, not just the National Monument, not just state parks. There's a lot of open space at Fort Ord. Some of it is set aside for protection of habitat. Some of it is available for potential development. But in all cases, whether you develop it or not, it has to be managed. And this is the document that will allow you to manage that habitat. If you're concerned about fire hazards, you need fuel breaks. We have goats grazing at Fort Ord, but you need permits to do these types of things. And so whether you're a proponent of development for residential use, industrial use, trails, recreation, you need to have permits. And this document will get you there. And it also has funding behind the document to implement it. So please take this document over the finish line, because 20 years is a long time to work on something. Plus, it's a good plan. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other member of the public?
Hello, Lisa Berkeley, City of Marina. Just wanted to thank you for moving the HCP along, and to echo what was just said, please get it over the finish line for everything that was just said to you. Thank you for your support.
Anyone else wanting to comment on this? All right, I'll bring it back to the board. I don't know that there's any particular action that we're being asked to take today.
Yes, Chair, the only question I would pose here is, you do have a potential for a workshop that would be on the 21st, and staff recognizes that poses some attendance questions for certain board members, and it also is probably right in the middle of 2 or 3 other meetings, and it might be better if that was postponed to a later date when it's closer to when the board is going to be taking an action. So staff thought that might be worth the board considering pushing that out a little.
That makes sense to me. Board members okay with not meeting on the 21st to have a workshop on the HCP and rather waiting until maybe after the first of the year when we've got more of the comments in and that sort of thing?
Excited about that change.
Yeah, okay. And I have asked FORA staff to, when we're gonna propose a meeting, to actually do a doodle poll or to start trying to set the date when people are present and can look at their calendars, because it was a little bit of a shock to get this notice that a meeting had been set and it conflicted with any number of things. So, good. And I do think it makes sense to wait a little bit and let things unfold a little more. All right, nodding. So no meeting on November 21st for a FORA HCP workshop. Great, thank you. We'll move now to business item 8D, Transition Plan and Implementing Agreements Progress Report.
Yes, Kendall has prepared another glorious and brief presentation.
Much shorter. Much shorter. I think you know this graphic quite well, so I'm going to go past that and kind of get to the meat of it. We've already seen, of course, transportation has been handled, habitat we just discussed, water augmentation, and of course the Army cleanup, which is basically the transfer of ESCA over to Seaside. Where we're at this point is that basically we have the implementing agreements. I want to thank each and every one of the board members and or legal team that submitted comments. The admin committee will be getting the latest, greatest, and really the one we expect to have taken to the various legal councils to have a final review. This particular implementing agreement is very different than what you perhaps have seen in the past. It really is very specific in terms of the role of the agencies, just acknowledging that they will not be getting any more money from FORA, that will be local roads will be their purview, that the friends from TAMC will be taking on the regional, water going to MCWD, et cetera, et cetera. Do look at this in detail, though, because this is the one that we're hoping is going to be executed by the various member agencies in January, February of next year. So if there are questions or comments, John Giffen and David Willoughby are ready and willing and able to take those. We have reviewed these again with all the various member agencies as far as talking with folks about what they wanted to see. We've reviewed this with FORA legal counsel. We will be presenting this to the admin committee on the 13th with the final board looking at this on the December meeting. The draft, I believe, is on the FORA website right now. It is part of the admin committee's agenda. So if anyone wants to look at it in advance, you can go right ahead and do so. And then, of course, we're hoping again for that first quarter signing. The implementing agreements regarding water, I did speak with the exec director from our friends at the Marina Coast Water District. My understanding is those agreements have been sent out. They believe that they have addressed the concerns of the agencies. However, I believe there's still a few out there that may have questions. FORA is not able to take a role in the negotiation of those, but we have taken a look at the water allocation tables that were consistent with what was agreed to between FORA and the Army, so those have remained consistent. At this point right now, our main goal, of course, is to wrap up the remaining agreements that are out there. There are about a dozen of them. I'll be meeting with Mr. Hulmard, Josh, and legal team probably within the next couple of weeks to just go through that last set, including a couple that relate to Marina Dunes. I guess we've got Marina Dunes, and there's a couple of others that relate to the colleges. We anticipate having those back out for final review and either determination by the end of the year. We are on track at this point to continue with having the HCP and of course the JPA and all these other agreements. The next thing for us, we'll really be looking at the dissolution of FORA assets, the funds that will likely be left over, and be looking for the board to make a decision on that. However, that will take place after we get the final look of whatever those Calpers expenses might look like, the final CIP, what that looks like, and all those kinds of fun things, as well as the mid-year budget. So that's likely to be in the February-March timeframe. So really not anything else to report on that one particular item today, but again, always available for questions.
Thank you. Any questions from board members on this? All right, thank you. Any public comment? Seeing none. All right, this is also an update, so we can say thank you and move to 8E, transportation study.
Hello, board. Hello. We've been throwing a lot of metaphors around today, and I'd like to say welcome back to the transportation train. We will be covering the 2020 transition transportation study today. The intent is really just to inform you as to what the contents of the study are, and I'll talk about why we did it. When the 2018 transition plan was put together under Resolution 1811, in section 2.2.6 of that transition plan that was put together, there was a requirement to do this transition plan study for the roadways that FORA had as the lead agency. And we were required to put together a study looking at the inclusion of the FORA roads and the impact of removing any FORA lead agency roads on the remaining roads within the network. So the purpose of this is to inform this board concerning the transition of the specific transportation improvements within the FORA Capital Improvement Program. So in April 2019, this board approved $150,000 to conduct this study. We brought on our consultant, Whitson Engineers, to do this study, and we continued to move that forward by working with TAMC in June to look at the various land use assumptions and traffic area zones. Land use assumptions, coincidentally, were it was done at the same time as we were putting together land use assumptions for the bond, so everything coordinated nicely with that. In 2019, we coordinated this draft analysis with TAMC. We sat down and looked at the logic that was an output of the model that the transportation engineers used, and we looked at that logic and made sure everything was sound. And then we presented the draft findings to the administrative committee in September. At that committee, they requested 2 additional points of study. The first was a trigger analysis. That is, they asked when a northeast-southwest connector would be needed. And the second thing they asked was a transit ridership analysis, wanting to know if you used another solution, for instance, like bus on shoulder, what would the increase to ridership need to be to decrease the impact caused by removing northeast-southwest connector out of the study. So we did those. We added that information and analysis into the study. And September 18th, we brought that updated final draft study to the administrative committee, and they reviewed it. And on October 30th, we then went in and did the final review with the administrative committee. So this information is what was presented on October 30th to the administrative committee, and I'll walk you through that. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a scope review. And the reason I'm providing maps here is it's just easier to understand the maps rather than the voluminous tables of numbers. We started by looking at the existing network. And in looking at the existing network, we said, all right, how many cars are moving through this network today? Now, there's some differences between this study and the 2019 study, and I'm going to point them out to you. Sorry, the 2017 fee reallocation study. The first is we included the road 218 to the highway. We wanted to look at that. That was not studied in previous studies for the regional network. The second is we looked at Coe Avenue alongside the boundary of Seaside through the former military base here. Thirdly, we included Reservation Road and some of the roadways within Marina and their impacts on the highway system. And then lastly, we looked at Imgen Road here. And we, instead of having it as a 2-lane road as it is currently, we asked our consultants to consider it a 4-lane road. The reason we decided to do that is because Marina is currently going through the widening process of that, and we said, well, let's look at it as though it were 4 lanes so that we could see what the impact of that is on the broader network. So then we ran through 5 scenarios. 2 scenarios had to do with the CIP, or 3 scenarios had to do with the CIP, and 2 had to do with removing items out of the CIP. So this scenario, scenario 1, is a look at the full CIP and all the roadway items within that CIP, and it includes the northeast-southwest connector. It also looks at 3 different types of northeast-southwest connectors. Those are scenarios 2 and 3. The first is a connector from Eucalyptus Road here over to 8th Avenue here, and allows traffic to move via this way down Inner Garrison Road, out through Reservation Road and through Davis. The second one is this olive solution here, which connects Eucalyptus Road to Inner Garrison Road and then comes around East Garrison down Reservation Road out Davis, and that is what is the current northeast-southwest connector. The third option is this one, and this was identified as an alternative within the EIR, or the preparation for the EIR for the northeast-southwest connector, and that's where it connects here at Eucalyptus Road and then wanders over and connects to Reservation Road here at Watkins Gate, thereby skipping all of this connection and moving around East Garrison. In scenarios 4 and 5, we removed the connector. So any of the connectors here we took out, and then in scenario 5, C5, we looked at Giggling Road. Now Giggling Road currently is identified as a roadway that needs to move from 2 lanes up to 4 lanes. That's a capacity improvement. We looked at it as leaving it alone and leaving it at 2 lanes and not doing a capacity improvement on that particular roadway and seeing what the impact would be to the system if we did that. So once we set the scope, which were the 5 scenarios that we were able to, I just ran you through, we sat down and looked at what we call traffic area zones. Basically, we figure out how many houses or jobs are going to be created in each one of these units. We worked with the AMBAG Regional Transportation Demand Model. We coordinated this information with TAMC. I think the key thing to take away is that there were no houses identified in this big zone or in the Parker Flats areas. And the reason we made sure that there was no residential identified in this area is we didn't want it to load, incorrectly load the connector. So that allowed us to make sure that there was no, I guess, false positives, as it were. I think we do have our technical staff, our consultants here with us, so they can use the proper language when talking about that. So the summary results, that's been provided to you in the transportation study. This is that big table I was talking about. I think the key takeaway is if you wanted to dig into it yourself, that red is bad. When you look through this table and you see red, just know that that's not what you want to see. What I did instead is I asked the consultant to provide in the study an analysis in a pictorial format, a map format, and so this is a result of the table in a more palatable form. So what we found on the first comparative analysis, what the study indicates, is that if you build the CIP out with any connector, the network stays mostly green, and you can see that through here. The network stays mostly green. We did find 3 areas of failure, and the first was Highway 1, but we already know that that's impacted. The second is Reservation Road. We already know that's impacted, and there's very little that this board could do to affect that. The second, oddly enough, was the connector which connected at Inner Garrison here. And so the question came up, why would a brand new road show it being a failure once you finish building it? And simply it's because the road's not big enough. Right now it is designated as a 2-lane road. That would not be big enough. It would need to be a 4-lane road. Now, coincidentally, we're glad we did the analysis on the alternative over to Watkins Gate, because if you do the alternative to Watkins Gate, then a 2-lane road is sufficient and you don't have to build a 4-lane road. That's the output of the study, and this is what it seems to be indicating as far as the analysis on that aspect. The next component is what happens when we take the connector out. When we take the connector out and when we take Giggling Road out, we see that there are 2 main impacts. The first is to Imgen Road. Even with its widening, Imgen Road fails from Reservation to the highway, and the 2nd Avenue becomes insufficient as a connector out to the highway as well. The second failure is Inner Garrison Road. Inner Garrison Road fails. We're talking bumper-to-bumper traffic, and then we see this becoming insufficient down 8th Avenue. And so those are, and Reservation Road to East Garrison also fails. So this becomes the major impact of removing a connector from the CIP. There is no impact if you remove Giggling Road. That was surprising to us. So if you leave Giggling Road at 2 lanes, there's no impact on the network. And then we'll move on to the next component. So this has to do with the 2 questions that the administrative committee asked us. And the first is, when will a connector be needed? Conversely, the other question is, well, it'll be needed when IMGN, Inner Garrison, and Reservation Road fail. And so through the analysis, which I'm going to show you in the next slide, it's estimated that those roads would fail between 2027 and 2032. Of course, all of that's dependent on growth and development, but that is the that seems to be what the analysis is showing, is 2027 to 2032. Then the other question is, can transit options delay or remove the need for a connector? The answer generally is yes. It won't remove the need, but it can delay the need. However, you'll need to come up with a ridership of about 5,000 riders per day. Now, that is a little difficult to understand, 5,000 riders per day. So generally what that means is you would need 64 buses moving between Salinas and the peninsula per day. It's a lot of buses, and at $1 million per bus, it's a lot of money. So here's the analysis on the timing of the connector. There's a lot of colors up there, and they're very difficult to look at because some of this information is noise as far as answering the question. So I'm going to get rid of the noise by kind of graying it out and focusing you on the blue area, which is really what happens to IMGN Road, Inner Garrison Road, and Reservation Road. On this side, you'll see that with a connector, they stay green, and they stay really healthy all the way through to 2040, if not longer. However, without a connector, you see failures happening, and they begin to happen within this time frame here. And so that is how they came up with the 2027 to 2032 time frame of when you see failures on that roadway, on those roadways. And so you'll need to have a connector built within that time if you want to avoid impacts to those 4 roadways. The study demonstrates, so the key findings, which are in your packet, is that the study demonstrates that this current CIP with the Northeast-Southwest connector has the most regional benefit. It also demonstrates that Giggling Road is not needed, it doesn't need additional capacity, and it also shows that an increase of ridership of 5,000 people are needed to delay the need for the Northeast-Southwest connector, and that connector may be needed between 2027 and 2032 to avoid any impacts on IMGN, Inner Garrison, and Reservation Road. So our general recommendation, because this is just an update, is to receive this report from the consultants, and I'm available for any questions, as is with the engineers.
Thank you. Any board members have questions on this? All right. Any members of the public want to ask a question or make a comment? Oh, was there something? All right, we'll bring it back to the board.
I just have
Lane, yes.
Lane Long, City Manager of the Marina. I had a question. Did this model in Highway 68 and the improvements on 68? Because I recall when the roundabouts went in or proposed to go in the 4 or 5 roundabouts, it talked about that would improve the traffic delays during rush hour by 20 minutes, but it also showed that it would only add 200 trips per day, and that never made sense to me. And so I question, if you looked at those impacts when those roundabouts go in, would that shift substantially more of the traffic down to 68?
I'll have Frederick Ventner, who's our expert on this, answer that question.
Thank you. So the Frederick Venter with Kimberly Horn, the roundabouts add really operational improvements at the intersections. You only add a lot of capacity if you add lanes. So what the model shows, so this in the analysis, this included the full AMAG model, and Highway 68 was included in that. So you will see a little bit of increase in volumes, and it is mainly because the travel time would improve, and because the travel time improves, some of the traffic would divert to Highway 68. But it's not a capacity improvement, the 68 roundabouts.
Yes, Director Garfield.
Thank you, Your Honor. Turn it off again. I was at the admin meeting when this was presented, and so I would like to put forth a question that was brought up then that the person who asked it isn't here. So are any of these scenarios dependent upon the road going unfettered through CSUMB? Because the CSUMB folks were pretty clear that they would take steps to make sure that that ridership would be discouraged through campus.
So the AMBAG model has been set up to discourage traffic through the campus, but it's still an attraction zone because a lot of students, and staff go there. But we did not close up into Garrison Road and 8th Street and Giggling Road. So I don't know if CSUMB is going to close those up, but we allowed those roads to be open. So that would be the primary routes, and that's why it shows up congested if we do any link to 8th Street.
Okay, I just think that's something to consider, is that the roads in their current situation may not stay the same given where they are.
Director Wizard and then Director Hoffa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll blame Manager Long for inspiring my question about roundabouts. Do you know do you recall if the model took into account the campus town development that's supposed to have roundabouts at Giggling and General Jim Moore, as well as Lightfighter and General Jim Moore?
There are some land use assumptions for the campus town, but not to the extent of the most recent EIR. We started the land use process quite some time back, and the City of Seaside, the information that was provided at that time did not include the extent of campus town.
Okay, and just very quickly, just to add on to that, but not necessarily a question, is that land use and development changes by the minute in this town, and I don't know what might happen, but there are some folks in Seaside that are talking about an initiative for an urban growth boundary in Seaside, and I think that would fundamentally change the inputs for the model if we project no growth whatsoever for the next 20 years in a certain portion of the City of Seaside. So, you couldn't have known that when you began the work. This board couldn't have known that when it commissioned the work, but it's hard to really nail down what the value of the study is every day there's new information. Yeah. So thank you.
Director Hoffa.
So to kind of follow up on that related to the housing assumptions, was this sort of based on each of the jurisdictions within the region achieving their RENA goals, or was it just where did sort of the projected housing growth come from? So both RENA goals, and then does it also assume kind of the full build out of the FORA plan?
So when we start the land use assumptions, the first thing we do is go to the jurisdictions and ask them, what are you planning and where are you planning it? So each jurisdiction provided us that information in June, July. It was the same information that we utilized for preparing the bond analysis, and so we tried to use as much of the most recent information that we could possibly use at that time. As far as reaching each jurisdiction reaching its RENA goals, that was not a question that we had asked. We expected the jurisdiction to provide whatever it thought its max output should be for the base reuse plan.
So may I address Marina's RENA goals? So Marina has 1,803 homes in our RENA goals this year, this cycle, and very few, I don't think, other than what's already been established, are in the former Fort Ord, and that's because the cap of 6,600 homes. So our downtown has to absorb most of that in a specific plan that's now in an EIR process. So I know Marina's RENA goals are not impacting this study.
It would be interesting, I guess, for me to see a comparison of what the jurisdictions said they're going to build relative to, or expecting to have built relative to their RENA goals. Because so again, to put it into context, ours is 650 by 2023. We've built about 120, and we're pushing really, really hard. We're not. Yeah. So it would be interesting to see. It would help me appreciate how realistic the housing assumption is, I guess.
The analyst side of me would also agree with you. If it helps, the report has all of our assumptions fully listed out, so you can look at the development assumptions used for each zone.
Great. Any other questions by board members? Seeing we've heard from the public, so that was, I think we did, right? Yes, he did, and it was on this item, right? So, okay, great. Yeah, all right. Thank you for the presentation. we'll move now to business item 8F, resolution to terminate Calpers contract and agreement.
Yes, staff requests the board to approve this.
Okay, any questions from board members on this? All right, any questions or comments from the public? All right, I'll bring it back to this board for action. Would someone like to make a motion to adopt the resolution to terminate the Calpers contract and agreement?
Second.
There's a motion and a few seconds.
Motion.
Okay.
Second.
All right. Any discussion? Yes, Director.
I have a couple of questions, but I'm not going to take the time for them. But one is what is the estimated time that we will know what the number is that Calpers will expect from us, and I guess how exact will that be?
Yeah, we've been in communication with the Calpers staff. Helen Rodriguez keeps connecting with them, it seems like every week, and the last information they gave us was that 60 days after this action is taken, they'll give us an item which is their last estimate. So January. That won't be maybe the exact number that'll be there in June, because you won't know that till the actual termination, but they're going to give us what is as close as we'll ever get within 60 days.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah. Helen's shaking her head.
So Calpers has decided that once we send this termination, they will give us one final determination number. They have given us an estimate anywhere ranging from the same as what we get on our annual valuation, which is anywhere from $7 million to $9 million. Currently, our most recent valuation shows that value at the low end at $7 million and the high end at about $8.3 million. And with the recent retirees that we had and the recent transition of some of our employees, they anticipate that to go below the $7 million, anywhere between the $7 million and $7.5 million. So we will not be able to get a number until actually after June 30, 2020. So there is pros and cons to that. The pros is that we keep the funding in parse, which will in turn earn more interest to defray more of the cost, if any. And so if there's any excess, whoever the successor agency and the board will have to decide how that's going to be distributed, and so forth. So.
And as you know, we have about $7 million in that account, the Section 115 trust.
Right. Director Wizard?
Thank you. So would it be more of just a technical question? Would we be able to adopt a resolution, or excuse me, would we be able to establish an escrow account that potentially LAFCO would draw from to pay that, and then the remainder would get distributed equitably, or would LAFCO be able to absorb that and add it to the litigation fund, or?
Right now, anything in the Section 115 trust has to be used to retire the retirement. If there's excess, we will ask them how we can apply it and bring that back to the board, so you'll know.
Thank you.
I believe the excess that's not required, if there's no longer a retirement requirement, could go back to for the liability or another purpose, because the funds that you used were not restricted.
Any other questions? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. We did it. Got through the business items. Now it's time for public comment. Is there any member of the public who would like to comment on any item not on today's agenda? Director Phillips is going to tackle them. All right, seeing no one coming forward, any items from members? All right, it's a Thanksgiving wish, and with that we will adjourn.